Okay,
You're live.
I'm live. Okay. Shalom and welcome everyone. I am Ann Sampson, Director on the Board of Congregation BINA and your host for this series. We are delighted with the even greater response we have received to this, the second event in the Sephardic Mizrahi series. The idea for this series originated in a discussion Alan, Herman, and I had many months ago. And Alan is from the Canadian Institute of Jewish Research. And we agreed that CIJR, as it is called, and Congregation BINA would jointly launch this series. Alan must be given full credit for all the work that he has done in pulling the series together. Thank you very much, Alan, for all that you have done and for all that you continue to do. We are proud and delighted to have this series supported by 7 wonderful Jewish organizations: the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, Congregation BINA, Kulanu Canada, Beth Rahim Synagogue, the Lodzer Center Congregation, Jews Against Anti-Semitism Canada, and Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights. Our heartfelt thanks to all of our supporting organizations who work so hard on behalf of Israel and the Jewish community, both at home and around the world. I must say a personal thank you to Ariella Daniels for designing the flyer and to Fleur Sampson for looking after all the technical details. This evening's presentation is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube Live. There will be a question and answer session following the presentation. But please use the chat only to post questions for the speaker. Thank you. It is now my honor and privilege to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. Alan Azoulay is a young and passionate noted scholar, educator, author, political activist, and entrepreneur. Currently, he holds numerous degrees in education, but his focus is in finance. Alan is the founder of Sephardic Legacy Series and author of 6 publications. He has chaired events for Sephardic communities from the United States Congress to the Canadian Parliament and the Kingdom of Morocco. In 2015, the Canadian Jewish News selected Alan as one of 24 Jews who are changing the world. Furthermore, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the State of Israel selected Alan as one of the 30 young professionals around the world who were deemed to be national young Jewish leaders. In 2016, he assisted with passing bills and lobbied at the US Congress for the anti-BDS movement. Currently, Alan is vice president of the newly formed Moroccan Israeli Friendship Association, which has stemmed from the recent Abraham Accords peace agreement. Alan is the kind of human being that is always seeking to do more for others. We are really happy that he resides in Toronto, and he resides here with his wife, Rina, and 3 children, Esther, Yael, and Uvadia. Welcome, Alan. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and a real honor. I'd like to thank literally the 7 organizations that have been supporting this Sephardic and Mizrahi series. And how shall I start? It's a little emotional for me when I specifically talk about my heritage, but I'll dive right into it. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Alan Herman and Doris Epstein of the Toronto chairs of CIJR, Congregation BINA, and Sampson, a founding member and a past president, and as well as Kulanu Canada, Andrea Spindle, the executive director, Jews Against Anti-Semitism, Agnes Imani, the founder and the president, Bet Raim Synagogue, Rivka Campbell, the executive director, the Lazar Congregation, Jeff Shabbos, and Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, Goldie Steiner. Thank you very, very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my love, my passion for Moroccan Judaism. So as today's topic, and I assume everyone could hear me. Okay, great. I see the nods and the heads. And it's a brief history of Moroccan Jewry, the untold story of an exceptional people. Talking about any topic in life, for me, it's easy. Talking about my heritage, it's something personal, it's something delicate, and it's something extremely sensitive. It's something that I live every single day, live by it within my community, my confines, my family, my mentality, my culture, and it's a different experience, is a great way to put it. But I'm going to back up before the history and the origins of Morocco, where originally the Sephardic story is a story in Jewish history and in the Jewish narrative that's completely untold, completely. And I'm going to discuss Chaim Raphael, a famous historian, his explanation and a quick introduction and segue towards Moroccan Jewry. And he says the following: the Sephardi world is an immense concept, far wider in range than it is indicated by its famous link to Spain and the Middle Ages. In one sense, indeed, the Sephardi story begins with the origin of the patriarch Abraham in Babylonia and the reformation there of Jewish life. At a later stage in Jewish history, the Jewish settlements in Spain was an offshoot of this. So in other words, Spain was an offshoot of Babylonia, and Babylonia was, I guess, the originator and originated from actual Jewish history. For example, Avraham Avinu, was born in Ur-Kasdim, was born in modern day Kurdistan. So geographically, the story and the narrative of Jews, period, was physically located in North Africa and Middle East, specifically in Middle East. And then it exploded from different exiles to Europe, to North America over the centuries and so on. But what created ultimately this main, call it, expansion and exile was initially starting in 539 BC, when King Cyrus the Great of Persia liberated the Jewish people from Babylonian captivity. So it's interesting, the dynamics were really split into three. The Jews spread out in three different ways. The first one stayed in Babylonia, which is modern day Iraq. The second one migrated to Iran, to Persia. And the third one actually remained there as in Palestine until the first and the second and the actual second temple. So the physical geographics restructuring of the Jewish communities from 539 BC was the beginning of the exile of Judaism, period. But it's interesting, after, when the Jewish communities were exiled, the Jews were actually brought to Iraq from the time of Nebuchadnezzar, as well as the Jews of Syria were from Ezra HaSofer. So what's happening is that what we read in the Bible, in the Torah, that the episodes that we see of these prophets, many of the prophets actually physically moved with the Jewish communities at the time, at 2,500 years ago, and so on. Actually, there's studies and the origins of the theories of Jewish Moroccan history that Jews were in Morocco pre the Talmud. So the Talmud was approximately written a little over 2,400 years ago. But we're going to get into the theories and to the origins of Moroccan Jewry. So that's pretty much the historical Jewish outlook of actual Jewish history. And now we're going to go and segue completely into Moroccan Jewish history. It's quite interesting, as they say, it takes, there's 5 Jews and 10 different theories, So the origins of Moroccan Jews has like 20 different theories of when it started. I'm not surprised. But all jokes aside, is that there's the main one that's fundamentally founded was that in 770 CE, looking at around 2,100 years ago, if not longer, was the ending of the Second Temple. Jews have been living in Morocco. There's many, and I have them written down in my notes and as well as in my mind, but the main one, which is very interesting and a little emotional of the origins, was that there was irrefutable evidence at the time that in Morocco, in a town, of a little gravestone of a 7-year-old girl, unfortunately. And in it, and it was in a town in Morocco, and it had ruins of a 3rd century synagogue that dated back all the way to antiquity. So there's that. There's other different proofs. For example, the Jews of Ifran, which is the Jews of one of the oldest cities in Morocco, came from 361 BCE. So you're looking at almost 2,400 years ago of the oldest Jewish settlement of Moroccan Jews. Initially, there were all Berbers there, and then later on came Jews, then Muslims, and so on. And there's, of course, different theories for that. But at the beginning, the origins of Moroccan history was really, really quite absolutely unique. But during these times, as the Jews are pretty much developing themselves into towns, into cities, into melachs, which is Jewish ghettos, which we'll discuss later on, they're establishing themselves. So one of the biggest influxes was approximately 2,200 years ago, where approximately 40,000 Jews moved immediately from the Second Temple directly to Morocco. And that was the beginning of the Jews of Morocco, the actual establishment. However, during this time, as much as the Jews were developing themselves, there was another world in Morocco, and it was the world of the Muslims. And of course, they were the majority at the time. However, there's a total of 9 dynasties, 9 Muslim dynasties that actually took over throughout the rulership of Moroccan history period. And a very, very interesting history, to say the least. And I'm going to define, and I'm going to be very sensitive, of course, what I'm going to mention now is defining Judaism period, the Jewish history period, and especially the history of Moroccan Jews, was more of a positive note than a negative notation in terms of the history, and as well as the influence, and as well as, I guess, the Jewish and Muslim correspondence between each other, the way they lived together. And one of the, I guess, tragic episodes, which I'm going to get into very shortly, is the story of Fez. So aside from the dynasties, I'm just moving completely forward into Jewish history. We'll eventually get into the Spanish Inquisition, but right now I'm moving completely forward into 800 CE. And Fez is a known city, of the city of scholars. Very, very interesting city. And it was the city of Chachamim, of rabbis, of sages. And during this early 19th century, they established great scholarly institutions, academias, in other words, known as yeshivot. However, at the time of 1790, which I'm going to go forward, then I'm going to go backwards, and you're going to see why momentarily, as there was always good times and bad times, like at any time in Jewish history. One of the most tragic episodes that I've ever read, and that's actually documented, was in the year of 1790 to 1792, the Sultan Yazid, he kicked out the Jews from Fez, and he kicked them out of the actual Jewish ghetto. He expelled them, basically. And as he expelled them, it was one of the hottest days of the summer, supposedly, and he literally told them, go on barefoot, leave, and kick them out of the Melech. And unfortunately, again, this is certainly one of the most tragic episodes in Jewish history, in Jewish Moroccan history. What did he tell them to do? He told them that go ahead, you have to go ahead and unfortunately dig your ancestors out of their graves. I know it sounds crazy to hear this, and literally rebury them at a different location within Morocco, which they all did. And what did they do? This ruler at the time, the Sultan at the time, they actually took the tombstones of the Jewish community of Fez, of the old old cemetery, and they actually built a mosque with it. And they actually put it on top of a synagogue. So that's one of the worst experiences. And if one is willing to, I guess, dispute this is just history. History is history, and that's that. However, what's interesting, as any ruler based in Jewish history or history period, is based on, I personally define, on a personality basis. So he had mental health issues or whatever it was back at the time, and he literally was, I think, a complete psychopath. And what this individual did, it affected the generations to come of Fez. And there's a 2-volume documented book called Fez Vechachmeha. And it's around approximately 200 years old. And in it, the rabbis chronologically put the stories of the history of Fez and all of Morocco. But yet they say that it wasn't just bad times. It was amazing times too. It was beautiful times too. And I'd really define Moroccan Jewish history as a complete upward roller coaster. What do I mean? Is you're always going to have downs in life. You're always going to have your ups and downs within, again, Jewish history or life personally. But at the end of the day, and what I mean is by completely going upwards is even look at now, which we'll get into the Abraham Accords and so on. But going back to Fez, the documentation in this volume, which is completely rare. I met somebody here recently in Toronto that has these 2 Hebrew volumes, and the documentation is phenomenal. And they write poetic letters to their sultans at the time. And that's their way of expression in terms of, that's sort of like a love letter. And when there was a bar mitzvah at the time, or when there was a eulogy and someone passed away, in order for, at the time, specifically in Morocco, actually, and this was originally from Spain, they would write and pen a personal letter for whether it was a bar mitzvah, a wedding, a social event, or anything. And this was a great form of communication. Unfortunately, you don't have that. You have Instagram, you have Facebook, you have text messaging that replaces that today. But anyhow, so back to Fez. Fez was, and I'm specifically talking about Fez, is that it was the cornerstone of Jewish scholarship, of Jewish creativity, of the Jewish mind, of Jewish philosophers. And from Fez was the foundation of all Jewish cities. And I'm talking about in reference to scholarship, because the Jews that were in the mountains at the time, again, this is just history and a fact as a fact, they did not have that literate scholarship. It was just based on hearing. Everything was based on repetition and completely on the mindset, where everything was just repeated out loud. For example, the Birkat Hamazon and prayers, everything was, I guess, uniquely together. And it was, and even Sidurim and books and literally was of the very, I guess, few. But Fez connected to the printing presses to Italy. It was very progressive. It wasn't a modern day city like Casablanca and Tangiers. It was more of an academic city. And that's that which we could elaborate much later on. Moving forward, there's so much to discuss about Moroccan Judaism and the history and the dynamics. And to get it in within 45 minutes or a half an hour, it certainly doesn't do justice, but the fact that I have here the opportunity to do this is, again, a great honor and a privilege. So I'm going to move forward a bit and regarding the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition completely affected modern day, at the time, Morocco. Why so? If Spain was further away, I mean, it's technically close to Morocco, just literally literally a boat over, and off the coast of Tangiers. And what happened was, it was very interesting. What happened, the Spanish Inquisition, if some of you know and don't know the history, I'll just give it just very briefly. It affected the entire Jewish world, where King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella on March 30th, 1492, expelled the Jews. And there was the conversos and other fragments of Jews that had to either stay there or actually get expelled. And that was the conversos. And long story short was that the Moroccan Jews who literally either expelled or ran away, there was 2 types of Jews in Morocco. There was the Megorashim. This is very interesting. And if anybody would want to know anything about Moroccan Jewish history, this is basically it. There's the Megorashim and the Toshavim. The Megorashim were the Spanish Jews who came later on to Morocco after the expulsion of 1492. And the Toshavim, which have been present since, call it the first or second temple, were there from at least 2,000 years. So you have this very interesting dynamic where there are 2 different types of Jews. You have the Spanish Moroccan Jews who are new and coming into as an influx to Morocco, and then you have the Toshavim Jews who were there and who were there from beginning of time, call it. There was a mega clash between the cultures of the 2. to the point that the Moroccan Jews, believe it or not, and this only existed for a few decades, they didn't marry within each other. They didn't attend the same schools. They had a complete polar opposite experience in their actual dealings. And as time went on, there was even takanot. There were enactments against each other, a complete divide. Because what was happening was that Spain, which was the world of Andalusia, was influencing majorly the dynamics and the past culture of Moroccan Jews, of the Toshavim. They didn't want that. The Jews of Morocco were there for 2,000 years, and they did not want to have any influence. So it's very interesting that that occurred. However, as time went on, like in anything, they ended up meshing together and mingling together and marrying within each other. However, very interestingly enough, up into date today, when a Moroccan Jew who has an actual original Moroccan ketubah, a Moroccan, how do you call, I guess, ketubah, I don't know the best term to describe it. Anyhow, was in the actual ketubah and the agreement between the husband and the wife, and it actually discloses where your originality is from. Are you Megorash or are you Toshav? Are you a Jew from Spain or are you a Jew from the actual origins of Moroccan Judaism? So I remember when I got married, it was mentioned that my wife's side was from Toshav and mine was from Megorash, which is very interesting. But the dynamics shifted because my father was Ashkenaz, so that threw everything off. But anyhow, all jokes aside, is that that's a very, very interesting episode that occurred in Jewish history, Moroccan history, that they didn't even get along, but to the point that they ended up mingling together and building their dynamics and their schools. And I have to mention one thing: if one is an expert in terms of Moroccan Jewish law and customs, it's completely, there's a lot of different customs, and up until today. So the influence from 500 years ago is still slightly affected, you could see, by the Moroccan congregations, either in Toronto or in other communities from Panama to New York or wherever it may be. So it's interesting, an influence and an influx of Jews from 500 years ago could still have an influence at a synagogue, at a custom, at a form of prayer. It's very, very, very unique to see that experience. I want to mention about the printing presses in Morocco. Why so? Because the printing presses were all connected originally to Germany, believe it or not. The first form of printing towards the Hebrew publications, call it Sidurim, Machzorim, or whatever it may be, was originally from Germany. And it started to have an influence towards their publications, where it had a complete, how should I say, conflict in terms of the literature. Fast forward, one of the biggest printing presses in Jewish history was Livorno in Italy. Most people know that. Most Jewish historians know that. Where in Italy was the biggest printing press for Jewish artifacts, Jewish publications, and so on. So later on, only Morocco got that around the 17th century or so. And it's very, very interesting to mention, and I have to make a mention of this, that there was more than any other Sephardic Jew outside the North African Jews, and particularly the Moroccan Jews, were very influenced from European Jewry. And I'll get to that later on, and we'll discuss, and even affected and imposed throughout their customs and so on. So I just have to mention that a typical Moroccan Jew is influenced like any other Jew, or I guess ethnic background. It's not a pure background. If a person's Indian, Iraqi, whatever it may be, the dynamics of influence throughout the centuries, throughout the decades of marriage and people coming from different cities and towns and countries, it's not a pure Moroccan Jew. So, but yet maybe those Jews lived there for 2,000 years, but the influence on those Jews were from different cities, different towns. They were maybe Berber, which is from the mountains, the Atlas Mountains. They were maybe French influenced, and so on and so forth, which we'll talk about French Jews later on. But when particularly, I'm sure many of you have heard, oh, a French Moroccan, a Spanish Moroccan. I don't, how should I say, I can't say appreciate. There really is no true historical definition, because it was constantly intermingling between the two backgrounds. So to say a Moroccan Jew makes sense. To say a French Moroccan and Spanish Moroccan Jew, personally, based on my historical background, does not make sense, is not accurate. As people constantly mingle. My great-grandfather was from the French side, and then his son moved to the Spanish side, so all of a sudden he's a Spanish Jew because it's more recent, so it's inaccurate. So that's just a perfect example. So we're going to start moving on towards, that's the 17th century and so on, is one of the best eras of time was the modern era, as we're moving towards the 18th and 19th century, as these countries are developing and getting more influenced from Europe. So for example, Moroccan Judaism or Sephardic Judaism had no reform, conservative, and different, the modern Orthodox, and all these different denominations. It was just a Moroccan Jew, and one was more observant than the other. What's my point? My point ultimately was there was no outside influence like Europe had. Europe had the foundations of reform, egalitarian, whatever it may be. And it didn't come into Morocco until the 19th century, which was the Alliance influence. And you would have a complete dynamic influence in the 19th century of those European Jews who came to Morocco, who influenced the Moroccan Jews in a different way. And it impacted them socially, religiously, and whatever it may be. My point is that there was a complete major uproar between the world of the rabbinical world, the world of the Orthodox world in Morocco in the late 18th century, really 19th century, approximately, and the world of the Alliance Israelite and of the, call it more modern Moroccan Jew. And of course, that was influenced from the European Jew. So there was, to the point was there was, again, another divide, a divide not about backgrounds of geographical, like French and Spanish, or from Spain and current Moroccan originality, was rather a religious identification and a religious crisis, to the point that they didn't attend to each other's schools and so on. There was still, everybody got along. Everybody was attending the same synagogues and so on. But the ideology between the two was completely starting to divide the communities, and where one community was becoming more modern over time, pre-1948, the state of Israel, towards and then as well as the complete religious dynamic. So as moving forward from that era, which is a very unique era, and again, there's so much history from the 15th, 16th century, 17th century, and so on, and we could discuss that. The story of Solhat Sadeket in the 18th century is another story, which I could discuss later on if there's enough time. But back to the 19th century, pre-1948, again, a very, very interesting and unique time, there was the Holocaust. And the Holocaust was a very, how shall I say, for Moroccan Jews, a lot of people think it did not hit Morocco, but it did. It did not hit towards, in terms of deaths, as the most per capita, or for the amount of Jews that died in the Holocaust from a Sephardic origin, was the Greek Jews from Salonika and so on. However, I've been to Auschwitz and I had the privilege to go to Poland, and there's a room of a library, and I'm sure many of you have attended there. And in the actual library in Auschwitz, there's the 6 million names, and you could search it, sort of like a Google search, but a physical search. And in it, I saw the name Kadosh, and I saw the name Azulai. So there were Moroccan Jews who died in the Holocaust because they were caught. Like there was a story that the one Jew was caught in Belgium, and he was a Moroccan Jew, and he was just there for business, and he ended up in a concentration camp and passed away. However, and this is my main point, in the time of King Mohammed V, during the Holocaust, a very interesting episode occurred. And an episode that has to be mentioned, and an episode that I think Yad Vashem has to fulfill. There still needs more proof towards it. It's a very delicate subject and a very delicate topic. But at that time, again, a positive notion, an amazing point in Moroccan Jewish history, where the Moroccan king was there for the Jews. And to the point that he saved, I believe, he single-handedly saved Moroccan Jewry, thanks to him. And in that episode of the Holocaust, as even though you had those few Moroccan Jews who passed away and who got caught in other countries or whatever it may be, was that the Germans started coming towards to Morocco, And even in Tangiers, they started having blueprints and camps and so on and so forth. Nothing actually rolled out in terms of death camps, but the plans were there. The blueprint was there to annihilate the Moroccan Jewry. And when Germany came to Morocco, interestingly enough, they were hit on two ends. They came to Morocco, but they were losing on the front in Russia because of the cold weather. But at the same, so they had to go back there. But at the same time, when they came to Morocco, they asked King Mohammed V. They said, "What's going on with your Jews? We want to do what we need to do and annihilate them." Of course, I don't know how the conversation went, but and he said, "There's no Jews here. There's just Moroccans." So ultimately, he was there for them, and this occurred in 1943, 1944, and the Nazis had, of course, a great influence towards France and connections, because France pretty much took over the territory of a part of Morocco as well as Spain did. That's why Spanish Jews and French Jews. So there was a lot of pressure for Morocco to cave in, and they simply did not cave in and give in whatsoever. And there was a lot of moves that the King of Morocco did that is not documented, that he did through other individuals such as Franklin Roosevelt, and as well as I have it here on my notes. Sorry, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. He was extremely good friends with them. And in it, he influenced through other media outlets and other, how shall I say, secretive outlets, call it through agents or whatever it may be, to push and to, how shall I say, procrastinate is a good way to put it, the influence and of Nazis coming to Morocco. So he was considered to me like an Oscar Schindler. And I believe he should have been put in the righteous of the nations as a rescuer towards Jews during the Holocaust. But that's another episode of Jewish history that has to be documented and implemented. So moving forward from this whole world of the Holocaust and how the Moroccan Jews were spared, the dynamics changed very much so, and it was completely sensitive towards the Moroccan Jews, as it was a very hard time, because at the time of the establishment of 1948 of the State of Israel, there was in Iraq the Farhud, which was literally Arabs, Iraqi Arabs at the time, openly and publicly defaming and killing Iraqi Jews, while Morocco wasn't that case. Morocco, they certainly had issue. There was certainly a lot of peer pressure against the Jews in terms of, now you have a Jewish state and so on. But at the same time, there was that animosity between the Muslims and the Jews, and not every Muslim, not making a general statement. However, at the same time, Jewish Zionists originated from Europe, Europeans came to Morocco, and there's YouTube videos of this by the busloads, and they came to Melachs, which is the Jewish ghettos and cities. They came to towns, they came to literally to the mountains, and would express, we have the Jewish state of Israel, come and move. And my father, who was born in a town called Al-Qasa Kebir, and also later on moved to Casablanca, he told me he left at the age of 14, and he remembers seeing his classroom as the weeks and days and months went by, and the entire class in school was completely emptying out, and everyone was either going to France or Israel at the time. So I believe that the expulsion, call it not expulsion, correct me if I apologize, but the fact that the Jews, when the Jews left Morocco, it was an influence from European Jews from the state of Israel, and as well as pressure from a certain portion of just Arabs within Morocco, and that really pushed the dynamics of the majority of Moroccan Jews to leave Morocco, to leave Israel, and to leave to go to France and so on, and eventually Canada and America and so on. So it's a very, very unique episode that occurred from there. But the story is a story that has to be properly told, and the story of the Moroccan Jews of Aliyah was an exceptional story, to the point that the state of Israel today, as we both know, Passover is coming up, Pesach's coming up. The last day of Passover is Mimona. The state of Israel, they declared that day of Mimona as a national holiday for that specific day. So it's very unique how Moroccan Jews even influenced the state of Israel because of not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of culture, in terms of ideology, and influence them, not just for Mimona to have great food and so on, but as well as influence them in the governments, and that's that. So the dynamics here are moving forward from the world of the Holocaust, the world of 1948, the influence of Moroccan Jews going into Israel, establishing themselves in France, Canada, America, and many other countries, and the type of Jews, of the quality of the Moroccan Jews, a very unique personality. It's something that most people don't talk about. I could talk about history all day long, and that's my expertise. But in terms of the sensitivity, the quality, the emunah, the belief system that's so automatic within the culture and the mindset of a Moroccan Jew is for one to understand and comprehend, could be, how should I say, not understandable, because there's a lot of emunah pshuta. Emunah pshuta means simple faith of God. And that simple faith of God ultimately connects them to a connection to God, to their religion. I'll give a quick example. My friend recently bought the tefillin, a Moroccan Jew, the tefillin of the Ben Ish Chai. Of course, I cannot disclose his name. And he bought it from the Sotheby's International Auction House recently, this past week. He paid $150,000 US for it. My point is that he told me, Alan, I'm not a religious Moroccan Jew, but I have so much belief that I cannot see these pair of tefillin, certainly the most expensive pair of tefillin that I ever heard of, and how he treasured it and how he gave it such importance for that Jewish artifact is just immeasurable. And I'm not saying that other Jewish, demographics wouldn't do the same, but the sentimental approach and the unique approach, simply because we don't have different, denominations of our background. When you go to Moroccan synagogue, you'll have a guy with a ponytail to any different physical look or whatever it may be, and we'll all be there together. And it's one Moroccan synagogue with no different denominations. It's very unique, because in history, unfortunately, we just got divided over time of our backgrounds and our mindsets and our cultures. In comparison to the Moroccan one, it's more of a unified voice. Granted that if one person's more religious than the other, they'll still be attend the same synagogue. So there's really no real and true religious, how shall I say, difference of the two, but rather just the level of observance. So that in itself is very special and unique. One thing I want to mention, that prior to the state of Israel, the establishment, that there was a rabbinic annual gathering. In other words, when I said the word unified of Moroccan Jews earlier, there's this, how shall I say, this unique bond amongst Moroccan Jews that especially existed then more than now, that there was a rabbinical gathering that they said that the rabbis amongst each other in Morocco said, granted, I may be more modern thinking than you, more secular minded thinking than you, or whatever it may be, but the rabbis decided together, especially 1953 was the last one, after the establishment of the state of Israel and the Holocaust, that we're going to go from the towns to the cities and have a, call it quarterly or monthly gathering to decide on what to do with our communities. And in every aspect, from the problems to the worst cases to the best cases, and how to keep our communities together. So the fact that you had a body and a rabbinical group that did that for a few 100,000 Jews at the time, representing Rabat, Fez, and many different cities, is quite impactful and quite something for us as Jews, or anyone for that matter, to acknowledge, to have that unify. You're stronger when you're together, ultimately. So this is just something I thought to share. And just to am I okay with timing? Yes? Okay. So anyhow, just to wrap up, is that there's so much to say, and the history of Moroccan Jews is very, very unique, to the point that it's a story that has not been properly told. There's many Jewish history books that do not mention properly Moroccan Judaism or Sephardic Jewry for that narrative. But there's a professor, Devinar from Washington, a good close friend of mine. He said the following: there are stories to be told, where there are documents to be uncovered, where there are experiences still waiting to be uncovered, recovered, and reclaimed. and a part of our story of the ancient Jewish communities, which we could trace back our history of 2,000 or 3,000 years, were no more. And the story of this ancient civilization of Morocco is a story of a destruction of a civilization ultimately, and yet is a profound one, a unique one, and is still relatively together. As time goes on, it's up to the Moroccan Jews to pretty much keep it together. So this lecture is honestly a step towards that direction, that acknowledgement, and that education of Moroccan Judaism. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I'd just like to remind all our viewers and listeners that if you have any questions, please send them in the chat. I haven't received many questions yet, but Alan, I've received a statement from Sabrina Kerbel. She says that she loved the history of Morocco when she went on the UJA Toronto trip to Morocco many years ago. And she found the Jewish communities in Morocco to be very warm and welcoming, except for the Jewish community in Fez. Why do you think that is?
Okay, so I do agree that the Moroccan Jews and Muslim Jews are uniquely warm and collectively warm. But I've been to Morocco and I had the privilege to be in Morocco. I'll give one quick story and then I'll compare the two of the cities.
Okay.
Where basically I think the cameras, okay. Anyhow, so in terms of Morocco, we were there for Shabbat once, and we're there Friday night, and we had to collect, and there was around 60 or so people who had to collect. We were lacking candles to light candles for the women for Shabbat. So it was Casablanca, it was May, boiling hot, Friday, right before Shabbat. And I went into the lobby and the lady I mentioned to the lady, we need candles. She literally took me to the alleys of Casablanca for like 10 minutes. I felt like I was like Aladdin, okay? And I was going through and trying to find these candles. And she went out of her way to find them for a Jewish group, which she had no connection to. So both the Muslims and the Jews have they're warm people by nature. It's Middle East, it's North Africa. So in terms of Fez, I don't know what occurred there. I know it's a much, much smaller community like Rabat, like Marrakesh and Fez. But in terms of Fez, I actually do not know why. I mean, I don't really know that maybe there was just one or two people who threw her off, but you could have that, a Moroccan guy in a bad mood or whatever. But all jokes aside is that I don't know why specifically Fez in comparison to others. Casablanca is a much more bigger city, but I don't know. It's too much of a small community to pinpoint that out.
Okay, here's another question. Would you call us Moroccan Jews to be Sephardic or Mizrahi or both?
Okay, great question. By the way, is the screen supposed to? Oh, it's okay. Okay. Anyhow, so Mizrahi or it's a big historical question, and the question defining that is very sensitive. I think it's a combination. I think a Mizrahi and a Sephardic Jew is the same. I'll tell you why. Because when the exile occurred, Mizrahi obviously means East, Middle East, and Sephardic is Sepharad is Spain, but I consider them as one because anybody who is other than Ashkenazi descendant is a Sephardic Mizrahi Jew. So based on, if one studies the history of the Rambam, Maimonides, he signs his signature, Moshe ben Maimon HaSefaradi, that I am Sephardic. And he writes it with a beautiful signature. And this signature identifies it's a Safed Tav, which is Sephardic Tahor, or it's a Sephardic acknowledgement. So in terms of splitting the two, I know it's very customary to say, oh, there's Mizrahi Jews, there's Sephardic Jews, there's Ashkenazi Jews, there's Yemenite Jews. No. Granted, the Yemenite Jews came from Yemen. Ashkenazi Jews are also split within Romanian or whatever it may be. But in terms of back to Mizrahi and Sephardic, it really comes down to, no, you are a Sephardic Jew, and you are either Persian, or even if people label that as a different Jew, or either you're a Moroccan Jew, a Spanish Jew. So that's how I define it. I call it like a unified Sephardic Jew, and that's based on my understanding and studies based on Sephardic history.
Okay, here's another interesting question. Someone says, my family is from Tetuan. Can you say anything about that community?
Absolutely. Tetuan is a Spanish Moroccan city. The famed Rabbi Yitzchak ben Walid is from that city. And originally they call it a mini Jerusalem, because it was such a religious town that it was known that if you would either smoke on the Shabbat, on the Sabbath, or anything defaming the Sabbath, it would be the Shabbat. It would be really, really, how shall I say, the Jewish community was very connected to the police in Tetuan and to many cities, to the point that they had such influence on the police that they would either put them in jail or fine other Jews for breaking the Shabbat. So you could imagine of how religious of a town. Can you imagine being in New York or whatever, and you're a Jew and you're not religious, and you're surrounded by that, and it's a very unique scenario. So the city of Tetuan was a holy city, a Spanish city, and a small city, small town in particular. But the famous Rabbi Yitzchak ben Walid, who does not have a name inscribed on his tombstone, was a very one could identify because his sons' names are mentioned to it and the families nearby. But I have family that is married to families from Tetuan, and Tetuan is a beautiful city in terms geographically by the mountains and so on. But there's no Jews that live there. There's around probably 2 to 3 Jews remaining there. I actually know of one of them, but I could pretty much name how many people live more or less per city in Morocco. But Tetuan is unfortunately not an active current city, a beautiful city and a Spanish city.
Here's another question.
Sure.
It says, great lecture, but is the experience of Algerian and Tunisian Jews quite different from that of the Moroccan Jews? For example, do Algerians and or Tunisian Jews have an emunah, veshuta?
Correct. That's the.
Did I say it right?
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Okay. So the it's interesting that the person mentioned that question. A great question. Is I don't like to ever give differences. However, I like to educate facts. And the Moroccan experience is very similar to the Algerian and Tunisian experience. However, the Algerian experience and the Tunisian experience, more than the Algerian, was all North African, of course, not Middle East. Was that Algerian was really hit by the Nazis. The Algerian and Tunisian, yes, they have that concept of emunah pshuta, which is the humbling approach of interacting to God, that you don't have to be religious. Not that I'm saying that not to, but you could be spiritual and not religious, is that form of Sephardic Judaism and Moroccan Judaism. It's not a way out of being religious, but it's absolutely it's a spiritual connection to God, to Judaism, to the communities, and to the rabbis in particular. So yes, a Moroccan, Tunisian, Algerian, if anything, Egyptian and Syrian and all that too. Of course, I believe European has that as well, where it's really the old school way was more simplified and did not have the distractions of today and so forth. But I do want to mention one thing, and I did not mention this in the lecture, was that the countries that such as Egypt, Syria, they had a really bad experience in comparison to Moroccan Jews being a Jew in an Arab land, because in Morocco, to be a Jew depends on time in history, of course, but for the past, call it 75 or 100 years, in the early 19th century really wasn't so good, was more or less fantastic, of course, different experiences. So in comparison to the Egyptian Jew, the Syrian Jew, you ask their experience about being a Jew in an Arab land, they'll trash the country. They'll say horrible things, 99% of them. So you can watch this on YouTube, read publications, do whatever it is. So the Moroccan experience as a whole is a lot more positive in comparison to other Arab countries. And that's why they participated in the Abraham Accords, which was not surprising. And the king of Morocco himself is a very modern king, and as well as an open-minded king and a person who loves the Jews. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay, here goes the next question.
Sure.
All right. In early times, some Moroccan Jews did not know about Hanukkah. According to the book Ner Hamarav of Rabbi Toledano,
yep.
They came before. Do you know what that means?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Most people would not know. So shockingly enough, the history of Jews or history period was not well communicated like it is today. Today you got Twitter, you got everything, so you could communicate anything immediately. So back in the day, the Jews that came to Morocco, there were Jews that did not celebrate Hanukkah at all for decades. And there's a contrary to belief that a lot of them heard of Hanukkah and a lot of them didn't hear. It's very contradictory within history, but they did not give a big emphasis on the miracle of Hanukkah. And for decades, if not even a century, I have to look into it, but did not celebrate it because they were not either educated about it or not really educated, did not know about the history about it. So yes, there was a point in history that the Moroccan Jews did not celebrate the story of Hanukkah, that they came pre-Hanukkah and pre the date of the actual burning of the temple and the entire story of the exile there and the entire narrative of Hanukkah, that they came there before. And that's that. Majority of the scholars, of the rabbis, say that they were not aware. I beg to differ. I just think that they found it miraculous, but maybe they did not find a reason to celebrate. I don't know, because at the end of the day, Moroccan Jews were not affected. So if they weren't affected, then why ultimately celebrate it? So maybe that's my analysis on it. But absolutely, Moroccan Jews did not, at a point in history, did not celebrate the story of Hanukkah.
Right. Alan, what were the languages that were spoken there? Someone wants to know.
Sure. So the main fundamental language is, of course, Arabic. There's approximately shy of 20 Arabic dialects. I may be wrong, so if I'm mistaken, I apologize. Moroccan dialect is different than Middle Eastern one, but Arabic was the fundamental main one. French, Spanish, and English. I would say in that order, and only those four. A little bit of German, and Dutch, because they came to Casablanca, but those were aristocrats, whatever, but I wouldn't even consider that. Ultimately, it's Arabic, French, Spanish, and English. French still exists, but it's dwindling down, where Arabic is the main mother tongue. English, because it's international, and is even well known then. There was a lot of American soldiers that came to Morocco and influenced the culture and the languages at the time in the 1940s and 50s. It's known. Spanish was very popular in the 40s and 50s, and prior to it, unfortunately, you could only hear an older lady or man in Morocco today speaking Spanish. The next generation does not speak Spanish in comparison to then. It was that town spoke Spanish. They all spoke Spanish and Arabic, or French and Arabic. So that's pretty much the dynamic today, where it's pretty much Arabic.
Okay. Can you tell us more about the Moroccan Jewish community in Toronto?
Sure.
Its size, number of synagogues, relation with the rest of the Jewish community, and Moroccan Muslim relationships in Toronto.
Sure. So I think you asked the perfect one, in a sense, because I happen to be wrapping up a book on Moroccan Jews in Toronto. Literally that centralized. So it's quite unique. It's called Our Journey, the Toronto Sephardic Experience, the Toronto Sephardic Journey. And in a nutshell, the history you want to know, or the current situation, or sorry? I can't hear you, sorry. Sorry, I can't hear.
Sorry.
It's okay.
The question is, please tell us about the Moroccan Jewish community in Toronto.
Okay.
Its size, organizations, all of those.
Currently, more or less. Okay. They came around more or less in the 1950s, and they had a French and Spanish Moroccan synagogue, just two. The average Sephardic Jew in Toronto is of Moroccan origin. You have Iraqi Jews, Bukharian Jews, Indian Jews, and other different dialects. In terms of communities, there's approximately 18 Sephardic synagogues on an average Shabbat. Moroccan, I would say 12 to 14. During the week around 10. I have it down to science. There's one Sephardic school. That Sephardic school is predominantly, I would say 60 to 70% of Moroccan origin. The rest is not, which holds shy of 300 students. There's Ezrat Achim, which is an organization that helps for the needy. That's more or less, I would say, giving food towards the Moroccan Jews and other Jews for that matter. So in terms of culture and influence and relations with the Muslim Moroccan community here, there's a great one. There's been constant organizations such as the CJMT, Community Juif Marocain de Toronto, where it established relations with the government here in Toronto and in Ontario, and as well as attended many Arab Muslim festivities. I attended many of them. So we had even like a, how should I say, beauty pageant or whatever they call it today, in terms of wearing kaftans and beautiful Moroccan garments for women, and really the relationship's like a brother and sister. It's beautiful. That's all I got to say, and that's the best way to put it. And I think it's a great example for many countries and ethnic backgrounds to learn from. So a lot of Moroccan Jews here for sure. Montreal has a lot more, but a much bigger community. Approximately 7,000 to 8,000 Moroccan Jews live in Toronto, and varies. But if you ever want to attend to a Moroccan synagogue, there's around at least 12 to 15 of them on an average Shabbat, and you could hear melodies that existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it's a beautiful experience.
Thank you. It's something to do with names now.
Sure.
With names. All right. They want to know, someone says, my name is Wahnun, which means son of
Wahnun.
Do you know anything about that last name?
Meaning? I do not. I happen to have a 4-volume background of set of genealogy and words I could look into later and get back to that individual. I actually happen to have a background in genealogy I'm obsessed with, and as well as names, and so I could find out about that later. Every well-known rabbi in Morocco, they created an encyclopedia. It's called Arzeh Lebanon, and it's 4,000 documented rabbis. So it's fascinating, the books that they published and so on. So back to that question, I'd have to get back to that at a later date.
Okay. So, and do you know anything about the Jews in Shaun?
Yes, the Blue City.
The Blue City. Okay.
Blue City. Yeah, it's more of a not a French or a Spanish city. It's more pretty much on the, one could correct me, but in terms of, it's more of a Berber Atlas Mountain Jews live there. I don't know much, to be honest, about that history. Once I start working on which I plan to publish a book on the history of Moroccan Jews, affiliated with the government of Morocco, which I got the green light recently, thank God, with the Ministry of Culture and Education. But back to that city, I did not get there yet. There's a lot of cities and a lot of towns, and that created also different customs and so on. But I could get to that discussion later. But back to that city, I do not know much. I apologize.
Okay. And for our last question.
Sure.
Why did the Moroccan Jews leave Morocco after 1948 if life was good for them there?
Best question. All questions I loved, but this topped it off. So really great question and a sensitive answer. I know that there was a lot of, within Morocco, the Arab world was in an uproar. Whether we like it or not, it's factual, it's documented, and Morocco followed suit with that. So like I said earlier, it was a combination of both. Moroccan Jews lived there even to the 60s and 70s. So it's not like everybody was forced at once. The one advantage of Morocco, there are other Jews of Morocco were not expelled. And I'll make that clear. Whoever says that is completely wrong. They are not refugees. A refugee is a person who is kicked out of their country, pretty much. Syrian Jews are refugees. Iraqi Jews are refugees. Maybe Algerian and Tunisian. I did not have enough time to study their history. But in terms of other Jews, they are refugees. Moroccan Jews had a phenomenal experience, but with a combination of the Alliance movement of Jews from Israel or predate Palestine, whatever it was, plus the pressure of some government officials in Morocco at the time, it automatically pushed them naturally and organically, is a good way to put it. Some left, I can't say forcefully, but it was just a natural occurrence where the Jewish demographic worldwide was all heading towards Israel, and that was a big movement. So the movement worked, and it influenced everyone. So it was a combination of many factors of why they left Morocco to other countries, and it wasn't a simple occurrence. But you know what? The Moroccan experience was a positive one, and it's a shame in a way that they left, but at the end of the day, it was meant to be. But the relationships is good. Over 100,000 Israelis go there a year to Morocco, and if not more from around the world. So, but to live there, there's around 2,500 in Casablanca, or if not more. So life is still there. It would be very interesting to see if there was more Jews there living there today, but it's a combination of many factors of what led them and not pushed them to move them out of the country. Okay.
Thank you.
That's a wrap.
Yeah, on behalf of all of us here this evening, I wish to express our sincere thanks for sharing your knowledge, and it is immense, on the history of the Moroccan Jews. We admire and commend you for all you have achieved through your hard work and perseverance for the Jewish community at large and for the Moroccan Jewish community in particular. We hope you will come back one day and talk to us about some customs and traditions of the Moroccan Jewish communities. I know they have special customs and traditions.
We got good
food. And the food. How can you miss the food?
I know.
Okay, so it would be nice to learn more about those things. But it's been such a pleasure having you here as our guest speaker this evening. Okay, and I must tell you that your history in saying that, you were well treated there as an Indian Jewish a Jew from India, I have to say that we Indian Jews were treated very well in India.
Beautiful.
No anti-Semitism ever. Okay, we were never harassed, none of that.
Unfortunately, there was a few of that, Moroccans, Indian Jews, but
yes.
The rest of the world, yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
However, before we say goodnight, I want to thank one more person that I missed, and that's Anil Schonberg. Thank you so much for being with us here today to make sure that our technical stuff goes well, and for assisting Fleur with whatever needed to be done today. And just to be sure, I'm going to rename our 7 organizations because somebody wasn't sure that I named all 7. So I think I will just do that once again to make sure. The 7 organizations supporting our series first is CIJR, Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, Congregation BINA, Kulanu Canada, Beth Raim Synagogue, the Lodzer Center Congregation, Jews Against Anti-Semitism Canada, and Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights. Thank you to all of them for all their support. And I would like to mention that our next webinar in the Sephardic Mizrahi series is scheduled for after Passover on Wednesday, April 7th at 8 p.m. Our speaker is Jacob Steinberg, who will speak on Suriname, the Portuguese Jewish nation in the Amazon basin. I never knew there was a Jewish community there, so it's news to me. But for your information, Jacob has informed me that he is going to cover many different aspects of this community that were definitely not part of his presentation that he did for Kulanu Canada last month. We look forward to seeing you all on April 7th. And until then, stay safe, stay healthy. Pesach Sameach to you all. Good night, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.